So now it's my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker for this morning. Elena Bennett is the Associate Professor in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences at McGill School of the Environment in Montreal. She's the co-chair of the Future Earth Project Eco Services, which aims to set the research agenda for ecosystem service research. She's a lead author in IP-BESS, the global assessment, and she's one of an international group of scientists collecting seeds of the good Anthropocene. So, Elena, thank you.
All right. Which one of these is the one that's going to... Oh, I see it. Okay. I've got to turn off Johan's alarm before I get started. No good to have alarms going off in the middle. Okay, great. So, wow, it's very bright. And I feel sort of naked. I'm going to do this without slides today. We're going to try this with just the graphic presentation, which has me feeling a little bit naked with no clicker in my hand, but I'm going for it. So I wanted to provide you all with a little bit of food for thought to get us started on this first morning of what promises to be a really stimulating, really invigorating conference. And I want to thank Daniel and Dave and the whole organizing committee for the invitation to come share some of my thinking with you. And before I start, I want to just set up the kinds of things that I was thinking about that led me to put together the particular thoughts that I put together today. And one was my desire to reflect on today's question. What are the deep or neglected leverage points for sustainability transformations? And so I really wanted to spend some time thinking about that. And then the other thing that really inspired me was looking at the conference website and all of the things that are coming up over the next few days. And in particular, looking at Jorn and Mariah's paper about leverage points that just came out in People and Nature. And there were two things in particular. So one was this idea, this quote, that humanity is sitting at a crossroad between tragedy and transformation. And we need to ask ourselves whether what we're doing is just chronicling the challenges or whether we're actually facilitating transformative change towards sustainability. And I knew that I have a desire to do that facilitation, but to do it in a way that acknowledges or even that takes advantage of the kind of rigor that we can bring to that sort of change as scientists. And I mean that scientists in the broadest sense. And then also from that website, the idea that what deep leverage points do when they're really successful is they link our ambitious targets and goals with tangible actions that help change mindsets and paradigms, the sort of thing that we need to cope with, as Jan said, the end of the world as we know it. So I'm going to talk about the role of narrative, of stories, as a possible deep and neglected, or at least not very well used, kind of leverage point in science, and a little bit about a project that I'm working on with many, many others here in the room that tries to figure out how we can access that power of narrative while still remaining rigorous in science. So I'm going to start maybe in a little bit of a strange place, which is with a quote from US Senator and now presidential candidate Kamala Harris, because it was really striking to me. And whether you know who she is or not, I think the quote will resonate with you because you will have heard somebody else say something similar. And what she said was, we need to address climate change based on science fact, not science fiction. And we all know what she meant, right? She's annoyed with all the climate change deniers who are bringing bad or even imaginary science to the table to support their arguments that what we really need to do is keep growing our economy and keep burning fossil fuels. But the statement, I think, misses a really important and perhaps critical role that science fiction, or maybe even fiction in the service of science, can play in our search for leverage points of transformation, in our search for ways to address climate change. So Charlie Jane Anders had a really nice article in the Washington Post about that quote, and the title was something like, we need both science and science fiction to address climate change. And she points out in this article that the climate crisis, and I would add to that many of today's crises about democracy, crises of growing nationalism, all of our environmental crises, that these are crises of faith and belief as much as they are crises of logistics or maybe even more than they're crises of logistics. And to address that kind of crisis, I think that we don't need so much of this chronicling of the details of the crisis and all of its logistics. What we need is to sway people's hearts, to change our mindset, to change our beliefs about what's possible. So if I put that into leverage speak, I might say that we need to stop thinking about the data points and the parameters and start thinking about how we change the very way that we see and understand the system. In some cases, that might be swaying people's hearts to realize that climate change and other environmental crises are real, and it's going to affect them and people and things that they care about, like the coasts of Louisiana. And in other cases, it might be changing people's hearts so that we have faith that a transformation out of this end of the world as we know it and into some other new kind of world is actually possible. And as I sit and think about what is it that has the power to sway people's hearts in that way, what speaks to me is stories. And maybe music and art, but we'll leave those aside for now, for another day, and we'll stick right now to stories. So one of the really grave dangers, I think, of the world that we live in today, this world in which we talk about fake news, in which it's difficult to tell fact from fiction or truth from lies, is that kind of situation tends to make people, all of us, feel powerless and adrift in the world. We're not really sure what to do when we can't even tell fact from fiction. And that means it's really easy for us as scientists to get caught up in this sort of never-ending battle of whack-a-mole, where every falsehood that comes up, we try to punch it down with another truth as soon as it appears. And I'm not sure that that's a winnable game. It's not an unimportant game, but I'm pretty sure that it's a waste of a lot of precious time and energy. And I wonder, what if alongside of that, alongside the discovery of truth that is sort of the bread and butter of what we think of as science, but what if alongside of that, we help people discover a different kind of truth, a deeper kind of truth, a truth about who they are, about who we all are, about our role in the world, about the human place on the planet, a place that requires, has great power and therefore requires great humility. And what if we can use those stories, that truth, to deliver some sort of hope, some sort of faith that a transformation to sustainability is possible in a way that inspires people to do what I think is the very hard work that's coming of trying to create a transition to a world that we want to have. So I want to put forward this idea of stories and scientific scenarios as leverage points. And if we have stories and scenarios as leverage points, then I ask myself, well, what do they need to do to create the kind of hope that we want them to create? So they need to be inspiring, for starters, right? But they also need to be plausible. They need to be something we can imagine. They need to be radical. They need to give us pathways. We have lots of targets, right? We have the SDGs. We've got lots of targets and goals out there, but we've done little to connect those to action. And so the stories that we want to tell need to be able to connect those goals to action, to create inspiration for ourselves. So if I come back then to the role of science and scientists, what is our role in seeking these sort of deep and neglected leverage points and doing that through story? So science, at its best, science is, I think, about storytelling. So what do I mean by that? There's a few things I mean by that. So first of all, as scientists, we collect data, all kinds of data, quantitative data and qualitative data. It doesn't matter in this case. We collect data, we build models to try to understand that data that we collect. We confront those models with more data, and all of this is in the service of telling stories about how the world works. And we also have science that's even more directly about storytelling through scenario development. And scenario development, it was first designed as a kind of war game technique by militaries. It was then taken by the business community for their own kind of economic war games. And then finally, it was taken up by the scientific community for our use and understanding maybe a quarter century or so ago. And it's been used, I think, to pretty good effect globally through scenario development like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and at all kinds of local scale. So we have used it in Wisconsin, Northern Highland Lakes District, in all places around the world to do this sort of storytelling about what different alternative or plausible futures could be. Most often what we've tried to do when we develop these scenarios is we explore a series of different what-ifs. And the way we did this in the Millennium Assessment scenarios, which I helped build, so I feel like I can pick on them just a little bit, pick on myself just a little bit, was we used scenarios to explore possibilities of different kinds of solutions. So, what if we focus on development and bringing people out of poverty? Or what if we focus on eco-techno solutions? Or what if we focus on watershed-based local management? And then we play those what-ifs out and try to discover or understand a little bit the implications of all of those. And I'm trying not to get too distracted by this. Hopefully you're getting distracted by it, that's good. So that was really neat, that scenario development. I learned a lot. I think others did as well. I think we did a pretty interesting job of exploring some of those what-ifs. But I also think that we missed a really important opportunity that has to do with looking for these deep leverage points. And in particular, in our scenarios, and I think it's fair to say in most of the global scientific communities, scenarios, we sort of fell short on delivering on the possibility of providing hope in a better future. And we fell short on illuminating some of the pathways that it would take to get to some sort of hopeful future. And I want to focus in particular about three bigger weaknesses or really important issues with these past scenario development efforts. So one is that they all tended to focus on the same small set of drivers and a handful of ideas about the impact of these drivers. So for example, we focused a lot on technology and whether technology was going to save us from all of the world's problems, or whether the potential for technology to backfire was going to create bigger issues than technology solved. And there's lots of these scenarios that have that kind of feature or featuring local adaptation sorts of things. So we have these scenarios that over and over and over again look at just the same handful of issues. We have tended in these scenarios to overestimate the power of a single solution to solve all of the problems. So, let's throw technology at it and see if technology is going to help us solve all of these problems. And then the third big issue is that we've really focused on the end game. So we get to 50 years from now, this is what these futures are going to look like, and we forget about exploring the pathway. So even if that future out there looks nice, if we haven't explored the pathway, we have no idea how it is that we're going to get from here to there, and that doesn't leave people feeling hopeful and inspired towards action. So hopefully I've convinced you by now that we need these inspirational visions of the future to build deep hope and impel us towards action and serve as a kind of leverage point for ourselves. And then also to work, these scenarios are going to have to be fundamentally realistic, so they can't paint a picture that we don't even recognize. But also they're going to have to be radically novel. No more exploring the same old ideas. We have to look at something new, and we have to look at the pathways that are going to help us get there. And I want to spend the rest of my time telling you a little bit about a project that I'm part of along with many people in the room. I know Albert Nordstrom is here, Unsi Biggs is here. She's going to be talking about some of the theories of change behind this project in the next session, so I'll just encourage you to go check that out. Laura Pereira, Rika Preser, many other people, Gary Peterson, Joost Vervoort, many people that I'm representing standing up here talking about this project. And what we did was we developed a novel method for scenario development to try to address some of these weaknesses that we saw in earlier scenario development efforts. And we built a kind of method that starts from the bottom up. It starts from today and works its way out to the future. And here's how that works. So we start with things that people are already doing to make their world better. And as we look out today and we see people becoming increasingly aware of threats to society and threats to nature, we also see that at least some people start to engage in new ways of thinking, in innovative ways of living, and in a variety of different strategies to create a more just, prosperous, and diverse world. And so we call those world's good Anthropocenes, and we call the efforts that people are making now to bring about those futures seeds of good Anthropocenes, because they're acting like little seeds trying to create good in the world. We have, as a project, collected over 500 of these from all around the world, and I'll just give you 2 examples so you can get a sense of the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. So one example that I like to talk about a lot is the city of Copenhagen. A few years ago, they decided that they wanted to have 90% of all of the food that they served in public cafeterias, so in hospitals, in schools, in government buildings, they wanted to have that all be organic. And they really quickly realized that they couldn't just keep serving the same food they had been serving, but organic, because it was far too expensive. They were going to blow their budget really quickly. So going organic meant that they changed what they were cooking. They were cooking less meat, more vegetables. It also meant that they were able to start cooking less processed food. That meant that they needed to retrain some of the cafeteria workers. And all of a sudden, we have this city that from one fairly small decision, we're going to eat more organic food, has a complete change in the way that they are eating, the way that they're growing food, the way that they're doing lots of things around food in that city. The other example that I want to talk about is a project called Health and Harmony, which works in Indonesian Borneo to try to address issues of deforestation and human health. And this is a situation in which a woman, Kinari Webb, went to Borneo, got worried and upset about the deforestation, and wanted to do something about it, and sat down and spent about a year just listening to people, just asking people, what's going on here? Why is this happening? Tell me a little bit more about it. And what she discovered was, of course, that people they didn't really want to cut down forests, that individuals who were doing this were often finding themselves in a situation where their mother, their wife, their child got sick, needed health care, they couldn't afford it, but if they could cut down some trees and sell the lumber, they could make enough money for health care. And so she started to realize that she could provide free or low-cost health care in exchange for individuals and communities committing to reducing deforestation, and that this was a win-win. People would have better health, and she would be able to protect the forest at the same time. And over the last number of years, they've seen about a 90% decrease in illegal logging and an improvement in just about every measure of childhood health that they can measure, including massive decreases in child mortality, which is really neat. So we're using those to develop scenarios, but before I talk about the scenarios, I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the other ways that we can use these 500 seeds to understand our world and to understand what leverage points are. So one thing is that this collection, it tells us a lot about what people think is wrong with the world today and about the approaches that they're taking to trying to fix those things. It can also tell us what kinds of fixes, what kinds of approaches address single issues versus those that are better suited to addressing many problems at once. So when do we get a city of Copenhagen where a solution grows and expands and builds into other sorts of solutions and other sorts of issues? And when do we get a health and harmony where we can build these win-wins from the bottom up? It really intrigues me when we see these seeds that are successful, and then we can look and say, well, what's the context of those seeds that are successful? What is it that's making them successful? Is it leadership? Is it context? Is it something about where they are or how they're approaching this problem? And another thing that really intrigues me about these is how a seemingly inconsequential part of a solution ends up being absolutely world-changing. So, for example, this listening that Kina Webb from Health and Harmony did, which she called radical listening, this sort of showing up with humility and empathy and trying to understand the problem versus coming in and delivering a solution from outside. You know, seemingly inconsequential, she probably didn't realize it at the time, but ends up being a massive part of what works about this solution and helps her to find this connection that we might otherwise not have noticed. And beyond this individual seeds or analysis, we're also developing methods to think about scenario development in a way that's novel and inductive. So how can we start with these seeds and build scenarios that do this business of being radical and novel and innovative and focusing on many different things while still being hope-delivering and inspiring. And we've tried this and refined this now at a number of different workshops. We start with a mixture of a few seeds, often with the leaders of those seed projects there with us in the room, and we found that it works best to have a mix of different kinds of approaches because people aren't just using technology or environmental change. So we have ones that are technological and ones that are environmental. We have some that focus on structures and we have some that focus on process. And for each one, we try to imagine what could it look like 50 years from now in its mature form? What does it look like when the whole world has taken on this idea that this is the way that the world should be? When we've done that for 2 or 3 different seeds, we then say, well, how do these interact with each other? So if I, for example, had a scenario development and my seeds were maybe something like the radical listening from Health and Harmony, maybe my technology is something like self-driving cars, well, that might lead to something where self-driving cars mean that I have more time, and if there's value shifts that say I shouldn't use that time trying to be ever increasingly more productive and write more science papers, I'm going to spend that with my family and with my community, then maybe we do some radical listening and that leads to listening councils and that's a new form of governance. And maybe from there that changes the way the economy works and we're able to have more of a sharing economy than an ownership economy and so on and so forth. And so we use that to sort of play out how this might evolve into a future. We then do some explicit focus on the pathways. So rather than just think about the 50 years out, we want to focus on how do we get from here to there. So we think about the 3 horizons framework for scenario development. So in the first horizon, we think about what has to grow, what things are going to build to get from where we are now to that future. And very often that has to do with things about the seeds of the good Anthropocene that we've just been talking about. We talk about the third horizon, which is what are the things that need to go away? So in the scenario that I just told you about, the sort of ownership model of the world needs to go away. And we try to imagine how those things that have to disappear or devolve would disappear and devolve. And then we think about the second horizon. What happens in that messy middle place in between that causes some things to grow and other things to go away? And from there, we try to tell a story that builds all of those components together into scenarios. And what I like about this new method is that I think it gets us to this really powerful leverage point. It gets us to stories that can change people's hearts, that can inspire us, that can affect the mindsets that we bring to understanding how the world works. But it does it in a rigorous and scientific way that addresses some of the issues that we've had with previous scenario efforts. So, for example, because the seeds that we start with are really diverse, the stories end up being more diverse. They don't focus on a single solution. We assume a much broader set of drivers. And so some of the scenarios that we've been involved with building in this way see things like gender dynamics or the way we approach work or ownership, things that haven't shown up in previous scenario efforts. We see those become very, very important drivers in this new kind of scenarios. We have this explicit focus on pathways, and so it helps us to tell stories that really show how are we going to get from where we are right now to the inspiring future. And then finally, I think it helps us see connections between different parts of our lives that have great potential to change the world, but maybe haven't quite made it into the sorts of stories that we usually tend to tell about the future. So 2 more thoughts. One is, I think there's 2 different kinds of leverage points that are embedded in this Seeds of a Good Anthropocene project. There's a sort of big one, the potential to sway hearts, to give hope in telling these novel scenarios about the future and developing stories that are hopeful, that are out there. And there's sort of a littler one, for lack of a better word, that is the power of showing all of these examples, of having hundreds of examples of people out there doing things right now, trying to make their little corner of the world a better place. And those little stories also allow us to study and increase the power of those projects by understanding how do we access leverage points, how do we increase the power of those actions, how do we get involved, as Jan said, but in a way that has both humility and rigor. So I want to end with a quote that to me kind of encapsulates all of this. And it's a quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. So you might know him as the author of Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, which is a very popular kids book. But he wrote another book called Citadels, that I find really, really inspiring. And the quote from that book that I want to share is this. He said, "If you want to build a ship, don't start by cutting planks and assigning tasks, but instead awaken in people a longing for the wide and open sea." And I think that a lot of times in science, what we've spent a lot of time doing is cutting planks and assigning tasks and trying to chronicle the problems that we see out there in the world. And I hope that now, with conferences like this, drawing 500 people from all around the world, it's a period of change when we might start seeing a different way to do science, seeing a way to do science that awakens in people a longing for a better future, that shows them that that's possible and it's out there, and that there's things that we can do right now, right here, right today, that will get us to that future. So as we continue on with the rest of our day of exploration and our few days of thinking about leverage points, and especially today thinking about our deep or neglected leverage points, what I hope that we'll do is remember to think about hope and storytelling and changing the way people look at the world as possible leverage points, and discuss with me or with yourselves or with each other, what are ways that we can access this and do this that don't at the same time sacrifice the rigor of science, but that leave us longing for that wide and open sea of a good Anthropocene. Thanks.